Good morning, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? Thank you very much for having Newmont come and talk about leadership as a tool for productivity. I think what I'm going to say today is that it is the tool for productivity and for sustainable productivity. So I know that Google has become the definitive source of information for a lot of us. We use Dr. Google when we're not feeling well so we can self-diagnose. And then there's Professor Google who has answers for everything. Tell me I'm wrong. I think we do that, right? So when I Googled the definition of leadership, I got about 1,500,000,000 responses. And if you ask 10 different people how they would define leadership, they would conceivably give you 10 different answers. And if you Google types of leadership, you get 2,340,000,000 results. Suffice it to say that leadership is an evolving discipline. We learn more and more about what it takes to be a good leader, including more recently where the neuroscience of leadership takes into consideration how the brain functions as essential to being a good leader. So what is a good leader? Let's start with what the work of a leader is. The work of a leader is to create, improve, and sustain successful organizations. Now, this is hard work, especially because the key to success is understanding people. And we all know how people are. We're all varied, we're all different, and sometimes unpredictable. But it's important to understand how people view the world so that you end up with the right people in the right place at the right time doing the right work. And this is hard. What we're saying is that leaders create the conditions that encourage genuinely constructive and productive behavior. Said another way, leaders create the culture inside of which work gets done. You could actually say that if leadership is the front of the hand, or this is the front, sorry. If leadership is the front of the hand, then culture is really the back of the hand. If a leader understands the relationship between what they do, how they act, and the culture that forms as a result of all of that, they will have one of the levers they can pull. In fact, the critical lever that they can pull to create the environment inside of which people can be constructive and productive in a sustainable way. So said in yet another way, the way in which you or I behave as leaders, and I make the case that if you're in human resources, you're automatically a leader because people are looking at HR to define how they should behave as well. So the way you and I behave as leaders within an organization has everything to do with the levels of productivity within the organization. When people look at their leaders, it matters what they see the leaders doing, saying, and behaving. The systems within the organization, the symbols, and the behaviors tell the people what the culture is within the organization, what is okay and what is not okay. And it impacts how they behave and therefore if they will be productive. So let's step back 1 minute. I'm about to arrange for a poll. I'm hoping it's going to work. But here's what it is. To be a leader, you have to be someone that people are willing to follow. You can't lead by yourself. Studies have been done of what people want from their leaders. In one longitudinal study conducted over 25 or more years, they identified the top characteristics of admired leaders. And there are 4 traits that have showed up over and over again as the top 4 by a very wide margin. So what do you think those 4 are? Are we ready for the poll? One minute. Okay. So just hang on a minute. You can think about what you think the 4 are without knowing what list I'm going to give you to choose from.
Africa is a subsidiary of Newmont Corporation, the world's leading gold mining business with a matched portfolio of assets, prospects, and talent.
Okay. Is the paper going to?
A legacy built on sustainability, operation.
Okay, so you've had some time to think. So you can put in the chat what you think the top 4 characteristics are of admired leaders. I'll give you some things to choose from. Ambition, broad-minded, caring, competent, cooperative, courageous, dependable, determined, fair-minded, forward-looking, honest, imaginative, independent, inspiring, intelligent, loyal, mature, self-controlled, straightforward, supportive. So those are options. So out of those or other ones, just put in the chat what you think the top 4 are. And now I'm going to tell you what the top 4 are. So the top 4 traits of admired leaders over time has proven to be competence, inspiring, honesty, and forward-looking. And what's interesting about these 4 traits, I'll say them again: competence, inspiring, honesty, and forward-looking. What's interesting about these 4 traits is that 3 of them show up again in a study that was conducted to understand how people determine for themselves that a source is credible. In other words, when somebody tells you something, that's the source, how do you determine if that source is credible? We call that source credibility. So people determine a source is credible by looking at the person's expertise, which we can equate to competence, by looking at how dynamic the person is, which we can equate to being inspiring, and lastly, if the source appears to be trustworthy, which we can equate to being honest. So if expertise, dynamism, and trustworthiness sum up credibility, and those are 3 of the top 4, we could actually say that for leaders to have followers, they must have credibility. Building trust, credibility, is one of the key levers that a leader has. I'm sure all of you know what DWYSYWD is. DWYSYWD. It's a key leverage point. So it's doing what you said you would do. DWYSYWD. And then lastly, the leader must be forward-looking. To be a follower, you must know where you're going. That's key. So to be admired as a leader, people need to have a sense that you're taking them somewhere. And they will go if you're seen as being honest, inspiring, and competent. In other words, if you're credible. So I think that makes sense. You can hear in that if you're working with leaders that are honest, competent, inspiring, and forward-looking, you'd be likely to follow them. The question is, would you give 100% of your effort, or even more, to that kind of leader? So what's even more interesting about this is that we've spent many years promoting people higher up in our organizations because of their technical ability. However, when we hear about really great leaders, it is not because of their technical ability. It's because of what people call the soft skills. Don't you often wonder why we call them soft skills when they're so hard? People want to work for someone and for an organization that matches their values. Otherwise, there'll be dissonance. If you want employees to be really committed, then the key is to have their personal values match up with the organizational values. The more this is the case, the stronger the commitment that the employees will have to the organization. So how do you know if personal values for someone align with the organizational values? So let's take a look at what people look at when they look at leaders to determine whether or not they are aligned. So how you as a leader are spending your time is one thing they look at, because that aligns with the values or doesn't. If you're someone who takes long lunch breaks or comes in late and leaves early, they'll look at that and they'll wonder, what is this organization about? How do you handle critical incidents? If there's a crisis within the organization, how do you handle it? Because that tells the story of who you are as a leader as well. What stories do you tell? Are you telling stories about how you just built your new house in some place somewhere while the employees are still struggling to figure out their first house? Those kinds of things end up being important. What is the language that is used within the organization? If the language that's used or that you use is the language of hierarchy and control, or is it the language of coaching and mentorship? What's being measured within the organization? What are you rewarding people for? Are they rewarded for doing what they're told, or are they rewarded for going over and above? These are the things that actually define the culture of the organization, and the things that people look to determine if they should invest their effort, and more importantly, their discretionary effort in this particular company. I read a lot, so I'll quote a lot of books in what I'm saying, but my latest read is a book called No Rules Rules by the CEO of Netflix, Reed Hastings. And he talks about a time in the early days of Netflix when he had to cut down the workforce from something like 100 people to 75. He and his HR person spent time looking at who they should cut. And they decided that they would look at people who were average performers and below. They would look at people who were toxic within the organization or people whose behaviors they considered not to be a fit. You know, those kinds of categories. To their surprise, after they cut back the organization by 25%, what happened was that productivity increased. The 75 people that were left were doing the work of the 100 from before and surpassed even that. And the lesson he's espousing is that to make sure you have the right people. The wrong people can actually drag the rest of the organization down, and they do it pretty quickly. There's a study that was quoted in the book as well, where they got groups of people together in a room, and they planted one, I'll call it toxic person, in each room. So in room number 1, they had a group of employees discussing something, and they planted someone who was maybe lazy and not motivated. Room number 2, a group of employees, and they planted someone who was, let's say, argumentative and controlling, and so on. And what was interesting about that study is that it didn't take more than 24 hours for the group to take on the characteristics of the planted person. That shows how powerful the lower performing people can be within an organization. And it's up to leadership to make sure that the right people are in the organization, doing the right work at the right time in the right place. People look at leaders to see if they will take the needed action in that regard. So I said there were 1 billion definitions or more of leadership. So regardless of the definition of leadership that you decide fits for you or that you subscribe to, I find that as a leader, there are things that we have to do in order to be the kind of leader that creates an environment that brings out the best in people. And I do think that's the work of leaders. Because people require something from leaders in order to be willing to follow. I've already said that DWYSYWD is an essential ingredient. I wish I could make that into a word, DWISWID. All right. So leadership has not always been a discipline or a subject for discussion. Leadership development has not always been a practice or something that corporations do. People started getting curious about the difference between leaders who were effective and those that were not. I think around the 1970s and 80s. It was clear that intelligence, or IQ, was not the differentiating factor. The smartest people were not necessarily the best leaders. A 1998 Harvard Business Review article called What Makes a Leader by Daniel Goleman spoke about the importance of emotional intelligence in leader success. And that was one of the first times when emotional intelligence started to come into play within organizations. It is indeed the distinguishing factor between great leaders and average leaders. So I remember when the article was published, and it was a seminal work. It was revolutionary in those days. Here's a quote from the article. "The most effective leaders are alike in one crucial way. They all have a high degree of what has come to be known as emotional intelligence. It's not that IQ and technical skills are irrelevant. They do matter, but mainly as threshold capabilities, entry-level requirements for executive positions. My research," this is Daniel Goleman, "shows that emotional intelligence is a sine qua non of leadership. Without it, a person can have the best training in the world, an incisive analytical mind, and an endless supply of smart ideas, but he still won't make a great leader." So that's why in HR, I think a number of companies end up with a professional track or an individual contributor track and then a leader track, because not everyone who is that smart or a genius can make a great leader. And you don't have to be super, super smart to be a great leader either. The converse is also true. The components of emotional intelligence are what allow a leader to become someone that others want to follow and create an environment in which people are willing to provide discretionary effort. Now remember that back in 1998, this was revolutionary. The shift from manual labor to the industrial age to knowledge work to the cyber age of today has made emotional intelligence even more important. And now we have access to this information. We actually know this now. Now we know more about how the brain works. We know that the brain is shaped by experiences. We know that the brain can form new neural pathways. It's called neural plasticity. And if you're not optimistic today, you can actually develop yourself to be more optimistic. If you're not empathetic today, you can develop yourself to be more empathetic. If you're not someone who is planful today, you can develop yourself to be more planful. The 5 areas of emotional intelligence that Daniel Goleman espoused back in the day were self-awareness, the ability to understand your emotions, your moods, and your drives, as well as the effect they have on others. The hallmarks of a leader who's able to do this are self-confidence, realistic self-assessment, in other words, telling the truth about yourself, and the ability to have a self-deprecating sense of humor. In other words, being able to laugh at your own foibles. The second is self-regulation, the ability to control or redirect disruptive impulses or moods, the propensity to suspend judgment, to think before acting. So the hallmarks of a leader who self-regulates are trustworthiness and integrity. And we've already said that those are one of the top 4 traits. Also, comfort with ambiguity and openness to change. The third element of emotional intelligence espoused by Goleman is motivation, a passion to work for reasons that go beyond money or status, a propensity to pursue goals with energy and persistence. And this shows up in leaders as a strong desire to achieve, optimism even in the face of failure, and organizational commitment. Then empathy, the ability to understand the emotional makeup of other people, having skill in treating people according to their emotional reactions. And this shows up in leaders as expertise in building and retaining talent, as well as cross-cultural sensitivity. And by cross-cultural sensitivity, I'm including gender cultural sensitivity. Then the last skill, or the last area that Goleman talks about, is social skill. Proficiency in managing relationships and building networks. An ability to find common ground and build rapport. So the hallmarks of a leader with this skill is effectiveness in leading change, persuasiveness, and expertise in building and leading teams. So you can see that a leader with high emotional intelligence is going to perhaps work better with their teams and their peers and with the organization than someone who doesn't have emotional intelligence. And you can also hear that a leader with emotional intelligence will likely be someone that you or I would be willing to follow. So with all the study being done on the brain, there's now the study of neuro-leadership, what leaders can do to support their people's productivity, satisfaction, and fulfillment. And the model that's most frequently talked about is the SCARF model. SCARF, S-C-A-R-F, status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. So status is about relative importance to others. People need to understand where they stand within the hierarchy within the company. They need to know whether they're this level or that level, whether they're doing well or not. Certainty. Certainty concerns being able to predict the future. So that ties in with the forward-looking we talked about before. People need to understand where they're going and to have some certainty about that, even in the face of uncertainty. If you're a leader who is a champion of change and understands change management, you'll know that within an uncertain environment, and we're all in an uncertain environment today, we're all in a VUCA environment, you actually need to create a foundation of certainty for the people who work for you. Autonomy. Autonomy provides a sense of control over events. Every employee needs to know what their boundaries are, what decisions they can make or not make, so they can have autonomy in the areas where that is allowed. Relatedness is a sense of safety with others, of friend rather than foe. You can call it psychological safety to some extent. And then fairness is a perception of fair exchanges between people. So these 5 domains activate either the primary reward or the primary threat circuitry in the brain. For example, a perceived threat to one's status activates similar brain networks to the threat on one's life. So if you happen to say something very negative to somebody like, you won't get promoted if you do that, as a passing comment, what that does in the brain, it creates a threat of life. And that person will not be productive for hours to come because they'll be thinking about what was said, perhaps as a casual comment, and yet it will be retained and will impact that person's productivity. So this model enables people to more easily remember, recognize, and potentially modify the core social domains that drive human behavior and therefore productivity. So you can see how a leader has access through these various models to increase productivity. So a definition of leadership that I like and that I've subscribed to for a while now is this definition: the art of mobilizing others to want to struggle for shared aspirations. Leadership is the art of mobilizing others to want to struggle for shared aspirations. And I like this definition for a number of reasons. I'm not going to go into all the reasons, but the definition leads to 5 practices of leadership. And I like the idea of calling leadership a practice, much like lawyers call their work a practice, much like doctors call their work a practice. I think leaders should also call their work the practice of leadership, because we're always developing in this area. And the 5 practices are modeling the way, inspiring a shared vision, challenging the process, enabling others to act, and then encouraging the heart. Leaders have a responsibility to behave in ways that when others see, they are clear about what is important. So in Newmont, in the Newmont world, we talk about visible felt leadership. And visible felt leadership is leadership that you feel and that you see. It's values-based, it's authentic, it's grounded in real caring for employees. In fact, in our 2021 strategy map, we have caring as one of the elements of our strategy. And we say that it's based on evidence and is a key predictor of workplace safety results and operational performance. We say that it's built on a foundation of trust and psychological safety. Because without trust, people don't speak up, teams don't engage, metrics don't reflect reality, new initiatives don't gain traction, people don't admit mistakes, people won't go the extra mile, people don't share ideas. Studies show that when trust goes up, injuries and accidents go down. So what does it take to build trust? So trust, another study, is based on a worker's perception of ability. Again, that competence word keeps coming back up. Integrity, again, honesty keeps coming back up. And empathy. So we can see the same elements coming through as we saw in the characteristics of admired leaders and as we saw in emotional intelligence. And really, you build trust by, what did we say we're going to say? DWISIT. Doing what you said you would do. So at Newmont, we're using visible felt leadership to bridge the gap between work as imagined and work as done. So when you talk about productivity, that's work, right? And there's work as imagined, which is what the leaders think the work should look like. And then there's work as done, which is the work, what the workers are actually doing on the ground. So leaders define the work that they think should be done. That's work as imagined. And then that goes to the managers to define more broadly and in more detail what the work should actually be. So that's work as prescribed. So we've gone from work as imagined to work as prescribed. And then it's handed over to supervisors, and they have to implement the work. So that's work as disclosed. And that's given to the actual people doing the work. That's work as done. And where trust is not there, there's a gap between work as imagined, what the leaders think is happening, and work as done, which is what is actually happening on the ground. And what visible felt leadership does, it bridges that gap because it puts the leaders out on the ground where the work is actually being done, talking to the people, talking to the supervisors, and interacting with the managers. It actually bridges that gap. And then we have a change model that starts with understanding the existing culture, how people behave now and why they behave that way, how they view their work, their leader, the systems, and the business. And then designing where we want to go, how we want people to behave, how we want them to view their work, their leader, the systems, and the businesses. And then we use the 3 tools of leadership to effect that change. Systems, the way we actually do things. Symbols, the non-verbal cues that tell people, doesn't matter what the leaders say, this is actually the way it is. And then behaviors, what we do and say, which again tell people, doesn't matter what we say, it's actually what we do. And that's what counts. So we build a pathway that allows for the dissonance to surface, that allows for consistency and persistence in order to effect that change. At Newmont, a few years ago, we defined the leadership brand for Newmont Africa. The brand is based on our 5 values. We're a very, very, very values-based company. The 5 values are safety, integrity, sustainability, inclusion, and responsibility. And for each one of the 5 values, we've defined 3 to 5 behaviors that are a demonstration of the value that we expect our leaders to demonstrate. Again, visible, felt leadership. And this year, we're cascading the leadership brand through the organization to give people a guide towards our values in terms of what we want to see, and to leadership, because we believe that leadership is at all levels. So some of the behaviors, for example, are under integrity. I do what I say and say what I do, keeping my word at all times. Again, that DWISD thing, doing what you said you would do. Under integrity as well, I hold my team members to account for keeping their word. Under responsibility, this is the one I like the most and I find the most interesting. I work to constantly develop my leadership ability. And that's what we all need to do. I'm going to mention Patrick Lencioni, an author who has written several books that leaders should read and HR should read. If you haven't read some of them, I'd invite you to do that. The first book he came out with was The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. His latest book I find the most interesting. It's called The Motive. And it's a story of 2 companies competing in the same industry. One CEO had an epiphany regarding effective leadership, which resulted in his company shooting forward and beating the other company hands down. The book tells us that leaders need to explore and understand why you are there as a leader. What is your motive for being a leader? Your motive matters. If you're there for yourself, you may not be willing to do the hard work of a leader. We've said soft skills are really hard work. And that hard work includes making the difficult and very unpopular decisions sometimes, giving the incisive feedback so people know how they should behave in order to ensure the sustainable productivity of your people. You know, that's what we're talking about today. And what is your role as HR? Let me say, what is our role as HR in ensuring effective leadership in our organizations? So first of all, HR people at all levels within an organization have to be leaders. Everyone looks at HR. And everything I've said about leadership this morning applies to all of us in HR. And then secondly, if you're a company that uses the business partner model, then we are the ones advising and coaching our leaders at all levels, including the CEOs of our company. Yes, we need to model the way. We need to challenge the process with our leaders. We need to make sure that our leaders are also honest, competent, inspiring, and forward-looking. That's part of our HR job. We can make sure, thirdly, that our leadership development trains and develops our leaders for the future. So at Newmont, we have various levels of leadership training, including leadership training at the regional leadership team level, then midline training for our emerging leaders, and then all the way down to frontline leadership training for our frontline supervisors. And all of those embody the visible felt leadership that I've talked about. Then lastly, I would ask you as an HR person to explore your motive and make sure that you are a partner in ensuring the type of leaders and the type of culture and environment that allows for sustainable productivity. We're going to be discussing this more over the course of the morning. I urge you to lean into the conversation, draw conclusions of your own, have your own thoughts about leadership and what kind of leader you are as an HR person. And let's learn from today's interactive session. Thank you very much for joining us this morning.